and welcome to the Consistency Project with E.C. Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings, and every episode I have the privilege of having a discussion with E.C. on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, it's our goal to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning into the show. Hello, and how are you, EC?
Wonderful.
Wonderful. We're gonna talk about recovery, how to recover better, and I think we're gonna get into the wonders of cold water.
Yes.
Ice baths.
Do you do that?
Cold
Do you
immersion.
have an ice bath up in Maine?
I don't have an ice bath. I do cold showers in the morning, which I know is not the same thing, but it is as close as I've gotten. I do not
every morning. Is that how you do the cold?
Just
shower?
about every morning, yeah. So I'll do hot shower at night, and then I'll wake up and get in the cold shower.
I think I've said this before, but now the whole entire audience will know if I haven't. So I did synchronized swimming for 8 years growing up.
Holy moly! Even I didn't know that. I love when I learn new things about you.
For 8 years in the summer, I would jump into a freezing cold pool for 4 hours and do synchronized swimming. I hate cold water. Amazing. It's nothing like SEALs, but it reminds me of like whenever I talk to the guys who former SEALs is they hate water. I sort of have the same thing. I'm like, I don't like swimming. I don't want to get in the water. I'm not doing your cold shower.
That's hilarious.
So I guess I should warn people that I might have a slight bias.
All right. Well, some other day we're going to get into EC as a synchronized swimmer, but we're not going to slow us down too much because we've got work to do here.
We do.
Okay. Outside of your slight bias,
right?
Where do we begin? What kind of context do we need to walk into this conversation with?
Yeah, I mean, we are going to talk about ice baths, but really also talking about recovery tends to be a popular question. We did actually do 2 episodes. They're a while back now. One was on measuring recovery to optimize performance. Yep. And then the follow-up was then how to predict optimal performance. And so we'll link those episodes in the show notes. I think there's a couple of important things that we really want to understand before we get into the weeds of recovery with this episode. The first is to always remember the main point of recovery. Recovery is so that we get better at performance, not to be maximizing recovery or become a recovery expert, right? Yep. So you can do all these things to like, quote, help recovery, but you only care so much as you see it pay off in performance. I mean, maybe there's some in the moment enjoyment or refreshment, but here, we're talking about recovery for performance sake. And so like, for example, we'll talk about contrast baths, water therapy a little bit, but basically if the contrast bath doesn't make you run faster or lift more weight, it's not a recovery strategy in the sense of improving performance. Maybe again, you just like it in the moment. So I think sometimes people will do things because they've heard the research on some mechanism. A lot of times it's about decreasing inflammation is the popular one, but then we actually forget to measure the outcome that we're supposedly doing it for. Are we, again, running faster or lifting more weights? And that is really key because I'm going to tell you, it's very easy when you're looking at these studies to be like, oh my gosh, it improved recovery. When you want to always be thinking, okay, but did it improve performance? Because I think that's why we're doing it, right? Mm-hmm. Another thing from that duo of podcasts is, we have to remember that the place that most elite athletes are actually trying to get to is a state of functional overreaching. And there's plenty more details in those episodes, but the word overreaching should already give it away. They're getting to the point where they're past the point at which their bodies can handle overreaching, and they will actually have some performance decline for a short period of time, in which the rest period, which is typically called a taper period, allows them to supercompensate back to a higher level, which is ideally timed at a specific competition. That's when they, quote, peak, right? And I mention this because I think sometimes we think about fatigue and soreness should always be avoided. Certainly the goal of your training is not to pursue soreness, but at the same time, find me an elite athlete or even just a high level non-professional athlete who got to that level without soreness or fatigue. Yep. They don't exist, right? And so this is where, again, I think people can get so focused on recovery that they might lose their way a little bit, like, oh, I should never be sore, without keeping that eye on performance. And so that line between overtraining and elite performance is rather blurry. And while I don't think a lot of our listeners are elite athletes, I do think the idea of how to progress at slower time courses and to less significant degrees still means that they have days of soreness ahead of them. Mm-hmm. And I think the final point I want to kind of highlight from those episodes is we don't have a good way nor do we need to have a good way to measure recovery. And that was the point of that first podcast, which really focused on measuring heart rate variability, or HRV, which is quite popular right now. The point being, recovery is important and necessary, but we don't need to measure it. We do recovery, we measure performance, which I already kind of hinted at a little bit. But so this podcast is trying to address the lifestyle and nutrition practices that could aid recovery while not necessarily thinking that we have to measure it.
Got it. Okay. So, silly, obvious question that perhaps doesn't need to be asked, but I'm going to ask it anyways. When we say recovery, we're going to keep using that word. What does that mean? What are we recovering from? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, totally. No, it's a great question. I think there's lots of different ways to be thinking about recovery, and it's not just one way. And that was also discussed on that Measuring Recovery podcast, because there are multiple systems at play here. There could be, for example, too much stress on the immune system, which I don't think people always think about in terms of performance, but upper respiratory infections are kind of the classic example where endurance athletes are more prone to those infections during periods of hard training. And guess what? You can't do very well when you're sick, or run hard, run hard and fast, right? So having a robust immune system is pretty important to be able to be training hard. And there's also theories that maybe we're recovering in the sense of our autonomic nervous system, which is that related to that HRV component, that rest can help better regulation of that system. You might also be recovering from the mental stress of exercise. Now, I don't think a lot of us who are listening to this podcast have the stress of being an elite athlete in the sense of, that's providing food on our table type of stress. But I know certainly there's great benefits from taking a rest day of just like getting out of the gym and doing something else, right? So you're excited to get back to it the next time. But the angle that we're really talking about today, that I think is probably one of the common ways people think about recovery, is recovering from the structural damage of training. So training results in damage to the muscles, even tendons, that during rest is what we regrow and repair to this higher level. And of course, if there's too much stress or too much damage, this would ultimately hinder our training. So we're primarily focusing on muscle soreness, really DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. And this is from the Hotfield paper in the show notes. But they describe DOMS as an ultrastructural muscle injury, ultrastructural meaning that you can only see it under a microscope. And the manifestation of DOMS is caused by eccentric, and I think this is also really key, unfamiliar forms of exercise. So the eccentric, I think people know, but basically the force can be higher during an eccentric part of a movement than concentric. So that eccentric would be like the lowering of portion of the squat, where the concentric is the raising portion of the squat. So the forces can be higher in that descent. I think what's really interesting there is that unfamiliar forms of exercise. I think, oftentimes we can be quite surprised that maybe I'll try a new exercise and maybe I didn't lift hundreds of pounds. Maybe I just did 15-pound thrusters, right? But how is that producing all of this damage when the weight really wasn't that heavy? A while back, we talked about muscle contraction and movements. It's really this coordinated innervation or activation of muscle fibers by the central nervous system. And so some of what training is doing, it's teaching the central nervous system essentially how to recruit more and more muscle fibers to the task, to do so in a way that's really more effective. And basically they order the muscle groups that are recruited. So when you do something new, that patterning isn't set yet. The coordination isn't there. The recruitment of all the muscle fibers isn't there. So you're more likely to overstress and damage kind of single muscle fibers. And so that's why this unfamiliar forms can be quite surprising when it really didn't have that much absolute intensity. Now, clinical signs of this delayed onset muscle soreness, reduced force capacities, increased painful restriction of movement. I think we've all had that one, stiffness, swelling, and potentially even dysfunction of adjacent joints. And it's considered a mild type of injury, but it certainly is one of the more common reasons why we might have compromised sport performance. And so the exact mechanism of why it's happening is unknown, but the damage has this local inflammatory response. The soreness tends to be delayed by that 48 to 72 hours. And so it takes a few days for it to really go away. But it makes sense of like why we care about this from a performance point of view, because ultimately, if we are too sore, we don't have as much force capacity, all of that stuff, it might be affecting performance, especially at the high level. The last thing I want to say about DOMS is there's no real diagnostic standard for it. So there's no real way to be like, okay, you have it and you don't. Of course, pain is going to be part of that picture. Someone's going to say, I'm really stiff or my muscles are really sore. But how do you measure it? And you say, okay, well, this is the degree of pain or soreness where you now have it. That isn't out there. Sometimes they will use lab markers. Maybe it's creatine kinase that you've probably heard about with rhabdomyolysis, which is a way more severe form of muscle damage. But they'll also look at inflammatory markers like IL-6 and CRP are common ones that they'll measure. What's hard about these markers is, and we talked about this again in the exercise as an anti-inflammatory podcast, but exercise in the short term can be inflammatory. In the long term, we know it's anti-inflammatory. So these markers can get really confusing because if we want them to go up and then down, we don't maybe want to take too much stock in being like, okay, they're high at this specific point after exercise because maybe the long-term effect is actually beneficial. But overall, that's what we're talking about in terms of recovery today, the muscle soreness damage and recovering from that.
Okay, so staying with DOMS for a minute before we eventually, I think, get into the ice baths.
Right.
Strategies for decreasing it or avoiding it altogether? Is there anything that actually can be done to prevent that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Prevent it, I didn't see very much. I definitely saw more work being done on what to do to lessen it. So now that it's happened, what do we do to make it be less painful, right? So there's a review paper by Dupuy in 2018 in the show notes. And in terms of reducing DOMS, in order from most effective to least effective, the strategies were found to be massage, then active therapy, then compression garments, then cryotherapy, which is like the cold chambers without water, then cold water immersion, then contrast water therapy, then electrostim. Stretching and hyperbaric therapy actually were not found to do anything positive in terms of reducing DOMS. Now, out of that list, massage, which was the clear frontrunner, it had over double the effect of the next ones, active recovery and compression garments. And active recovery and compression garments had double the effect over the next ones, the cryotherapy, water immersion, all of that stuff. So those were definitely the top three to reduce DOMS pain: massage, active recovery, and compression garments. So okay, cool. That's how we can maybe reduce DOMS pain. But then again, your immediate follow-up question should be, does that matter for performance? Mm-hmm. What we kind of started off with. And there, what's interesting about this is we have to remember that maybe some of these things do in the moment have a quality of life element to them, that maybe, yes, maybe massage does decrease your pain. That's good in the sense of course, walking around stiff all day is no fun, but is your performance really better off for it? We're not really finding a ton of evidence there, right? So massage, which was a clear front runner, the Davis paper in the show notes says there's no evidence that massage improves performance directly. The Ortiz paper in the show notes suggests there might be a psychological effect of active recovery, but there's weak evidence to show it does much in terms of performance. Then taking the next most highest rated one in reducing DOMS, compression garments. This is the Nagyesi paper in the show notes. They didn't find that the compression did much of anything for recovery in terms of muscle strength. So we've got these strategies to maybe reduce the pain and improve the immediate quality of life, but we don't see that corresponding payoff in terms of, okay, and yes, they're now also improving performance.
Super interesting. Okay. As we've alluded to, as I just mentioned, it feels like what's two things. One, that's in that list that you just gave out, but that seems to be, massage is obvious, active recovery, everybody kind of talks about that, but there seems to be kind of in the zeitgeist, this idea of like, get in an ice bath, right? Yeah. So where does that, or can we unpack that a little bit given its current kind of like cultural popularity? Like what does it look like, or what does it do as it relates to DOMS?
Yeah. That Dupuy paper does find that it has some effect on decreasing DOMS. So again, from a kind of pain perspective, okay, taking it to the next step there, just as we did with the other strategies, do we see it pay off in performance? And, I wanted to look into that because like you mentioned, it is so popular. So I wanted to take that one as well to the next step. I found a recent review paper. It's the Malta 2021 paper in the show notes. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis. We know we talk about those all the time. It was looking at the effect of regular cold water immersion for use in strength and exercise performance. And so besides pulling together all the different research from different studies and why we like these meta-analyses, what's really awesome, in my opinion, about this study is it looked at regular cold water immersion. Why is regular so important? So a lot of times these studies, what they'll do, especially some of these older ones that I saw, is it's kind of a one-time thing. They have people come in, they have them exercise, go through something that makes them sore, they dip them in the cold water bath, and then they exercise again, and that's the study. So it's kind of like a one shot and done. When in reality, that's really limited. We don't want to ever take one training session and extrapolate that to say, okay, this is how it's going to shake out for long-term performance improvement. And so this study pulled together at like, okay, what does cold water immersion look like across like a repeated use in a training cycle? And of course, they also looked at performance markers, not just inflammatory markers. So they looked at things like a 1 rep max or a time trial or, power tests on isolation machines and all of that stuff versus just like, okay, inflammation signals went up. Okay, what did they find? Quote, the regular use of cold water immersion with exercise programs has a deleterious effect on resistance training adaptations, but does not appear to affect aerobic exercise performance. And then continuing, quote, evidence regarding the positive acute effects of cold water immersion on recovery parameters like markers of muscle damage and or inflammation, DOMS, and muscle performance do not seem to contribute to greater long-term adaptations to training. For example, acute reductions in the post-exercise inflammatory response following a single exercise session and cold water immersion have been interpreted as positive. However, inflammation is an important component of the muscle repair process, and limiting inflammation may be counterproductive for long-term training adaptation. End quote. I mean, I wanted to read all of that because that's just so eloquent on how they say that and the problems with, hey, if we take this short-term look at what's happening with this inflammatory response or decreasing inflammation, we really don't know how that's going to shake out. And so they actually found that there was a decrease in performance in terms of resistance training when you start to look at more of the long term. There's also a hack, I think is how you say it, 2022 paper in the show notes. Now, they didn't look at cold water immersion. They did look at cryotherapy. So that's, again, like the cold chambers of air for 2-3 minutes, something like that. This was a single study, not a meta-analysis. But what I liked about this is, one, they were looking over a 6-week training program. So again, kind of regular use, more than one session. And they were looking at performance metrics like a 3-rep max squat, as well as like a jump. So it wasn't just sort of, again, inflammatory markers. Basically, they found that the cold didn't do much, good or bad in terms of performance, except having cold therapy did not help increasing jump height, where people who did not get exposed to jump height actually saw an improvement in that. So their conclusion was that repetitive whole body cryotherapy does not appear to blunt adaptations to a concurrent training program, although there may be an interference effect in the development of explosive power. And so they recommend that sport practitioners can cautiously apply repetitive whole body cryotherapy to support recovery post-exercise. And particularly, they need to be looking for explosive power and if that's getting hindered because of that recovery technique.
Okay, so that it runs counter to, as I mentioned, as we've been talking about, the sort of the popularity of this as a method of recovery. What's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is definitely what's going to get me voted off the island, right? One of the things that's really interesting about this whole ice water baths, cold water baths, is how to accurately assess the placebo effect. Yep. And my friend John really pointed this out to me, but I saw it reiterated in some of these papers about cold water immersion. To understand what the placebo effect of cold water immersion's a little difficult. In a supplement study, it's easy. You make the pills look the same and you just change their contents. And so the participants don't know what they're getting. They don't know what's inside that pill that looks the same as the other group, right? And so they're blinded to the treatment. And so we can see that the people who maybe didn't get the active ingredient, if they have an effect, we know it's a placebo effect. Well, how do you blind someone from cold water treatment? It's impossible for someone to sit in cold water and not know they're sitting in cold water.
You could tell them that they're synchronized swimming, though.
That's right.
They might not notice.
Right. So they know what treatment they are getting. And I think for a lot of people, you have to almost be living under a rock to not have heard at some point that cold water plunge is good for recovery, right? So how do you separate out what's like a true effect of this actually doing something for performance and what's simply a result of somebody having the expectation that it's doing something, which we talked about in the beta-alanine and belief podcast. They have the expectation that it should make them feel better, and so they do. And so a lot of times the studies with the cold water immersion, if the Placebo is just like people are going to stand around on dry land and other people are going to get dunked in the cold water. That's really not a legitimate comparison. Now, thankfully, I did find a study that did basically was able to test this placebo effect. It's the 2014 Broach paper in the show notes. What they did is they put as the placebo, as one of the placebos, they put people in warmer water, and they also told them falsely that they were getting this recovery oil that had similar effects to cold water immersion. So they were made to believe, hey, this new research has come out, and so we know this is as effective as cold water. And lo and behold, those who were in that warmer water experiment had the same recovery time course as those that were in cold water immersion. And therefore, we know that the cold water has that placebo effect. And that's why people are feeling it's beneficial. So I will say, if you love kind of the ice water baths, there could be some short-term quality of life, like I mentioned. It's mostly just that pain reduction. The Dupuy paper did have some evidence of DOMS reduction from it, as we already mentioned. And I even found a Cochrane review from a while back, 2012, that looked at cold water immersion and found that it did reduce DOMS. We like those Cochrane reviews, if you remember, because they're very stringent on all the data they pull in. And they found that, quote, there was some evidence that cold water immersion reduces delayed onset muscle soreness after exercise compared with passive interventions involving rest or no intervention. So maybe that's kind of the best way to think about it, but it doesn't seem to be doing much in terms of performance. And arguably, some of those researchers would argue that it might be a detriment to performance. So I think some of why people love it is they think it's refreshing, or they feel like it's working, or maybe they are truly invigorated. And so you want to think about it, okay, that's why I'm going to do it, but you're really not getting a lot of gains from it.
Okay, so I want to ask about nutrition, but a couple cold water questions first, just in case you haven't been kicked off the island yet. I'd like to make sure I really hammer this home.
Right.
One of the things you and I obviously came up and through the world of CrossFit. One of the things we see at the CrossFit Games every year is an event followed by video of athletes jumping in the cold bath. Like and I think people kind of extrapolate that out to mean, well, if they're doing it and I'm training pretty hard, even though maybe I'm just training once today, that makes sense. I guess I'll go jump in it. What's happening there? I imagine that, these CrossFit Games athletes, they're professional athletes. Like they wouldn't be doing something unless it had some amount of effectiveness to it or efficacy to it. So what's going on there that isn't what you're talking about here, what we've been talking about?
Yeah. Again, if there is some short-term pain relief, that can be quite beneficial, especially in a competition that is multi-day back-to-back and highly painful.
That should be the CrossFit Games' new tagline.
I don't think any athlete there would describe it differently than that, right? Like it's certainly not easy and they don't feel refreshed after finishing it.
Yep.
So it's interesting there, like where's the line of decreasing pain versus the potential to decrease performance? And I don't think that's really teased out in a way that's really relevant to the kind of the CrossFit Games. Remember, a lot of these tests, when they retest performance, sometimes if we're lucky, we'll get a 1 rep max back squat or a 3 rep max back squats, but sometimes they're just doing isometric holds on leg extensions. Why? Because it's repeatable, it's doable, all of that stuff. And so it's hard to say, like, I don't want to come out and say that I think ice baths are harmful for performance. I think, that might be a little bit strong because it's like, well, what's the next performance thing? If you just did something that was super taxing on the legs, sounds like CrossFit, right? They're really sore and you can decrease the pain so that you're more confident for the next event. Does it really hinder that performance, or does it help it because you have less pain? And that is going to be a really hard line. And so this is where, kind of the try and see method comes to be the answer. It's like these athletes have done it enough. They know their bodies. They know what it feels like. I'm sure that they've tried ice water baths before getting to the CrossFit Games. And I think half the battle for them is having confidence and belief in what they're doing, even if we don't have the scientific study to prove that it's better. And I think that's what I said also with kind of Matt Fraser and beta alanine. Do I think that Matt Fraser should be taking beta alanine? Yes, because he believes it helped him. Now, whether or not it truly was that, or just because he had an amazing capacity and work ethic, I think it's probably the latter. But because he had belief in the treatment, it is powerful for people at that level. And so I think the same thing is true for the ice water baths. That is it really helping them? Probably not. They'd probably be okay without it. But having that confidence during such a high level competition is huge.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk about nutrition. Specifically as it relates to this idea of optimizing recovery. Anything worth mentioning, anything that the research or the data suggests is useful, more useful than cold water, less useful, whatever?
Yeah. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think it's so important because, I mean, even myself going through the research, you can really start to get in the weeds. We only care about recovery so much as it improves performance. Like
Mhm.
maybe a supplement does lower my CK levels in the blood. If that doesn't change how fast I run the next day, what is the value in taking it, right? Assuming, again, I'm not at like extreme rhabdo levels of CK.
Right, right.
Uh, and so there might be something nutritionally that you would think, okay, well, maybe there's some aspect to reduce soreness, and maybe that there's that short term, um, quality of life improvement or something like that. But from most of this stuff, my nutrition recommendation strategies are going to be my performance nutrition strategies. Like
Mm,
anything that I would recommend for performance is also going to be the same that I would recommend for nutrition. Now, in terms of that soreness aspect, though, we potentially could look at some anti-inflammatories or antioxidant compounds to maybe reduce the DOMS in the short term. Thankfully, we have a Cochrane review from that in 2017. They looked at 50 randomized placebo-controlled trials. Quote, there was moderate to low quality evidence that high dose antioxidant supplementation does not result in a clinically relevant reduction of muscle soreness after exercise up to 6, 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours after exercise. So that's a no. So in
yeah.
terms of like supplements to reduce DOMS, I mean, maybe there's some other, I don't know, creams or something like that that has an analgesic effect. But for the most part, in terms of like trying to take kind of high dose supplements, which has been a theory for some time in terms of DOMS, no, not evidence for that. And so then I just fall back to my basic performance nutrition recommendation strategies. Eat enough adequate protein, zero point 0.7 grams per pound of body weight, maybe up to 1 if you're doing a ton of lifting. Get enough quality in the diet. I like the 800-gram challenge to help you do that. And then make sure that you have enough calories. Maybe with performance a little bit, you look at that split between carbs and fat, because maybe that can be affecting your performance. And we talked a lot about that in the How to Fuel Performance episode. So I don't want to belabor that. But the point is, like, my recovery nutrition strategies are kind of going back to my performance nutrition strategies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, again, like I kind of just want to sum it up for people. Like it's really easy to get bogged down and like, oh, I just want to see improved recovery. Maybe they'll measure DOMS. Maybe they'll measure pain. Maybe they'll measure inflammatory markers. But again, the next step is, okay, did they measure performance? And then the next step from that is, well, was it a one-time thing? Did they come on and test these people on one day? Can we look at what this recovery technique is doing day after day after day? And ideally, when they're measuring performance, it's something that's meaningful to you. One of the old studies I looked at for cold treatment, I forget if it was cryo or cold water immersion, but basically we were looking at the accuracy of tennis shots. And they found that like the cold treatment increased the accuracy, basically the equivalent of like they got 11 out of 20 shots correct. And the people who didn't get the cold water treatment, they got like 10 out of 20 shots correct.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, is the performance metric that you heard about actually also relevant to you? And so those are kind of the steps that we have to go through to be assessing this kind of recovery literature. And in terms of performance, I don't have much beyond the nutrition strategies that we recommend all the time.
All right. So last question then is, and I don't know if you have an answer to this. I don't know if you paid enough attention to this as you were reading through and looking at the research to speak to it with any confidence. But we've been talking about performance very specifically as it relates to an athletic endeavor of some kind, right?
Yeah.
Whatever that perhaps be. Did you see anything as it relates to maybe what we could still call performance, but that wouldn't be a kind of an athletic performance? In other words, like a focus or just maybe lower stress and the ability to, get through life with any kind of, with clarity, whatever it might be. Again, however you might define performance.
Yeah.
Is there anything as it relates to, again, I'm thinking about the cold water specifically, because I think that a lot of people will claim, will say, and I will too, we said at the start, I'll do a cold shower in the morning, and it's not for no reason. It's not because I'm trying to enhance my workout later in the day, right? Because I find that it's a nice bolt of clarity and focus, first thing in the morning. And so I'm not doing it for any kind of, again, athletic performance, but I do think it has some carryover to just performance day to day.
Yeah.
Did you see anything that might be favorable to any of these strategies in that realm of life?
Yeah. I didn't, because I got kind of in the weeds of performance, but I do think there's something there. I think, and I don't want to speak too much about like whether or not they've been able to do studies on like cognitive function in a way that's a controlled trial and stuff like that. But again, there's a lot of power in doing things that we believe are good. And if you feel more invigorated and energized, and that's why you like to start your day and you feel that you have more clarity, I think that's your answer. I don't know that you want to wait for a double-blind placebo-controlled trial to tell you that you're not actually that much more productive. Maybe you're, minorly more productive.
Right.
That's interesting. I probably should put on the list of things to look into. But I also, this is where it's like, I'm not really against people, if you like it or it's something. I think too, there's a mental aspect of like doing something hard and like committing to it. And I think there's some positive things there to gain from it as well. And so I don't like to shoot all of this stuff down. I also just don't want everyone buying like a cold barrel ice plunge thing for their house because they really think it's necessary kind of for this, better back squat or something like that. But yeah, I think in your case, it's just like, you kind of feel in the moment better. And even that can be worth it, right? Because that's just a quality of life thing.
Yeah, love that. Okay, cool. Thank you for giving me permission to continue.
I will not be joining you.
And for telling us that. And now do you have videos or photographs of you as a synchronized swimmer? Can we perhaps put this on Instagram?
No, I don't know about that. Those are the days of social media. So.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep trying, folks. Thank you everybody out there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. They do help new folks find the show. So if you have not left us a review, please consider it. And especially if maybe this is the first time you checked out the show, make sure you're following us or subscribed wherever you are listening so you don't miss another episode. Speaking of, EC and I will be back next week with another episode of the Consistency Project.